Hello, today we will be talking about carbon credit, discussing the different types and markets, as well as analyzing their efficiencies and deliberating the different moral dilemmas of such practices. This presentation is by
Sierra,
Catherine,
Maddie and Rose. So first off, what are carbon credits? Carbon credits can be thought of as a tradable CO2 emission token. These tokens can be bought or sold by companies. A company is able to sell a carbon credit when they can prove by a third party that they are either decreasing 1 ton of CO2 emissions from their overall emissions, or if they are able to prove that they sequester that CO2. They can then sell it as one carbon credit to another company that is then able to emit that 1 ton of CO2 as they have now bought one carbon credit. This allows companies to be deemed net zero if all their emissions are covered by carbon credit. So a company needs to buy the same amount of carbon credits as their total emissions, or you can think of this as their allowable CO2 emissions. So what are the different types of carbon markets? Well, there are two main types. There's by force or by choice. The market of force is called the regulated or compliance market. This is where a state or legislature will cap the amount of carbon each sector or district can emit. This is also often referred to as a carbon cap, which is different than a carbon credit. The carbon credit is when companies have a surplus of CO2 emissions that they can emit, meaning that they are emitting at levels below their cap, and they can sell these hypothetical unemitted CO2 emissions as a carbon credit. And there are many locations that already have this in place, such as the EU, Australia, China, and Canada. The other type of market is called the voluntary market. This is where organizations can choose to sell or buy credits for capital reasons. How this normally works is projects will predict how much atmospheric CO2 they believe their project will either decrease or sequester, and then a third party will verify it, and this allows them to sell it as a carbon credit. The main issue with this is that there is no current registration system to keep track of how the credits are sold and to whom they're sold. And yeah. So an example of the compliance market would be when one company is emitting less than their cap, and then they are able to sell their additional emitted CO2 permissions to another company that has excess CO2 emissions. And the voluntary market is when a project like solar panels is projected to decrease the overall emissions of a local area or system, and then they are able to sell these projected decreases to a company that is emitting a lot of CO2.
So what are the different types of carbon credits? There are three main types of carbon credits: reduction, removal, and avoidance. Reduction credits make up 22% of the carbon market and are any action that decreases as opposed to prevents greenhouse gas emissions. Some examples include cleaner and more efficient fossil fuels and methane reduction programs implemented into farm or municipality waste systems. It's important to note that greenhouse gases like methane can be normalized to carbon emissions and sold as equivalency credits. Removal credits make up 3% of the market and include any action removing carbon from the atmosphere that can be deposited and stored. The overwhelming majority of removal credits are in nature-based solutions like reforestation, as opposed to engineered solutions like direct air capture and storage. This is because engineering solutions are currently too expensive. Unfortunately, nature-based processes are far less durable than engineered solutions. Carbon is more susceptible to re-entering the atmosphere via deforestation and wildfires, and nature-based solutions only sequester carbon for an average of 50 years. Finally, avoidance credits make up the remaining 75% of the carbon market and refer to any action that prevents a carbon-emitting activity from happening. Renewable energy technologies like solar and wind power fall under this category, which can also include actions like avoiding deforestation. Estimates of avoidance carbon credits are determined by the projected emissions had a greenhouse gas emitting project occurred. Reduction and removal credits are measured in comparison to the IPCC business as usual scenario, which outlines projected carbon emissions at the current global emission rate. As aforementioned, avoidance credits are measured by the expected emissions of a greenhouse gas emitting project.
Okay, cool. Now I'm going to talk about how you calculate the greenhouse gas reductions of carbon credits. As Rose mentioned before, 1 carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide emitted from the atmosphere. And when you're creating a carbon credit project, you have to calculate the number of carbon credits that you can sell. Now it depends, like the number of credits that you can sell depends on the project. So I'm going to walk you guys through a reforestation example. So let's say you're reforesting a certain like acreage of land. There are different ways that you can calculate the number of carbon credits that you can sell. For example, you could find the number of trees in the area and multiply it by the amount of carbon dioxide each tree removes per year. You could find or calculate the number of new trees planted and multiply that by the tons of CO2 removed per tree, or you could do it by the inches of topsoil added every year and then multiply that by the tons of carbon in the topsoil. The problem is when you're doing this mass balance, there's a lot of nuances in this process. The first of which is that you, as the owner of a carbon credit project, aren't actually doing these calculations. You hire a third party, which are the certification agencies, to calculate the number of carbon credits that you can sell and to create the certificates themselves. And in theory, hiring a third party would make your data more reputable. However, the problem is that these certification agencies are competing for your business. So it is within their best interest to pick the calculation that will be able to allow you to sell the most carbon credits possible. And there's like these certification agencies, because there's a lack of regulation in the area, they're not legally responsible for misrepresenting the amount of carbon that you're extracting from the atmosphere. And there are also other risks to these projects, such as drought, wildfires, and natural disasters that could wipe out your forest and then affect the value of these carbon credits. And the reality is that only 12% of carbon credits sold actually result in real emissions reduction. And this has major impacts to the overall economy, because you have these, when the carbon credits are inflated, and then you have these big companies like Shell and Disney buying the carbon credits to meet their zero emissions goals, their emissions are offsetted. And then when you start like zooming out to the overall economy, we're really failing to meet emissions goals, and we're really risking meeting overall climate goals on a global scale.
This graphic illustrates a few ways in which carbon credits fit into the food, water, energy nexus. Carbon removal credits like reforestation can decrease agricultural land, which negatively impacts food production. On the other hand, they can finance sustainable agricultural practices like precision agriculture, which uses sensors and data technology to improve irrigation efficiency and ultimately saves water. In the same vein, carbon credits sold in the voluntary market can fund reliable, sustainable, and affordable water supply systems. Conserving water lowers energy costs for water and wastewater treatment processes, as well as for transportation across long distances. Carbon avoidance credits generated from renewable energy sources have huge potential to improve sustainability within the nexus through processes like solar irrigation. In contrast, carbon removal credits made available by engineered carbon capture technologies are currently very energy intensive and require great cooling capacities, both parameters that will increase water and energy use.
So in today's world, carbon credits and this industry is becoming more and more common. So this is really important now before it becomes even larger to consider the ethical dilemmas. So this has been talked a little about in this presentation already, but it is important to consider whether the current carbon credits are actually scientifically legitimate. So there's kind of two reasons why they might not be scientifically legitimate. Firstly, we have the issue with baselines. So the baseline is this level that the carbon credit companies set as the emissions that would occur without any of the carbon projects. These baselines are sometimes hard to set because from year to year. There can be different environmental or just human factors that can cause the carbon emissions to change. Right now, oftentimes historical data is used, but as forest fires and other natural disasters are becoming more common, this can make this historical data inaccurate for a baseline. Also, carbon credits have another issue with scientific legitimacy because we're currently in a retroactive system, which means that if a big company is purchasing carbon credits, the carbon has not actually been removed yet. The companies that the credits are coming from have 1 year to remove this carbon from the atmosphere. So this is important to consider because if the baselines are inaccurate, then the amount of carbon that companies are saying they're removing is going to be largely inflated. So there's been a lot of recent research on these baselines and the scientific legitimacy of carbon credits. So REDD projects are reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So what I have here is from a recent research study, and these are from 12 different voluntary carbon credit projects. And on the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have cumulative deforestation. And the dashed line is where the different carbon credit projects occur in time. And what we're seeing is that the orange line is the deforestation projected. So this is the amount of deforestation that the companies are using as like their baseline. And then in the blue, we're seeing the actual deforestation in these different locations throughout the world that is actually occurring. And we're seeing big discrepancies from the projected amount of deforestation used as baselines and deforestation that is actually observed. There's only one scenario of these 12 voluntary projects where these are similar and matched. The impact to this on a global scale is that if these baselines are showing greater deforestation than actually is occurring, the carbon credits are not going to be accurate of the amount of carbon that is getting reduced. So if large companies like Shell and Disney previously discussed are using carbon credits to reach carbon or net zero, then this is not going to really be the truth in the grand scheme. Another large ethical dilemma with carbon credits is their impact on Indigenous communities. So I wanted to just kind of show a lot of different impacts, but on different projects, different communities are going to be impacted differently, of course. So there has been a lot of forced removal of Indigenous communities from land, whether so this land can be used for carbon projects, but then these Indigenous communities are losing this land that is very important to them. We're also seeing companies stop Indigenous communities from grazing their animals in their typical and traditional ways, which is harmful for communities to get their food, but also just in terms of their traditions. We're also seeing that when companies come in to create these carbon projects, carbon credit projects, we're seeing them create division within different Indigenous communities because there's different perspectives. And we are getting in the middle of their own communities. Also, the Indigenous communities that have been living on the different land know the land and the environment very well. But we, or the different carbon credit industries, have not been consulting these community members. And this is really important because they know the land and they really do know what's best. And if we want this world to improve, we need to have all voices and perspectives at the table. Also, we're seeing a lot of illegal land use or non-consensual rights getting signed away from Indigenous communities for their land.
So we just talked a lot about the negative sides of carbon credits, but there are a few benefits. Carbon credits spurs and financially supports the innovation of clean energy, and it also forces companies to start reevaluating their emissions and looking into ways to reduce their overall CO2 emissions.
As problematic as carbon credits are, there is a lot of potential to make them effective and to use them to create real meaningful change regarding climate. First of all, we need more regulation of carbon credits to help fight misrepresentation. And there's this really neat framework called AVID that we could use to create an effective carbon credit system. AVID stands for additional, verifiable, immediate, durable, and the plus represents other community benefits. And the best way to sort of explain this framework is to, yet again, use an example, such as selling carbon credits to fund installing solar panels on low income housing. It's additional because instead of burning fossil fuels to create energy, you're using solar panels. It's verifiable because you can track the amount of energy that you are creating through people's utility bills. It's immediate. As soon as you install those panels, you're making a difference on the climate. It's also durable, with the exception of your house getting wiped out in a natural disaster. Solar panels usually last for several decades. And the plus here, there's a massive community benefit because landlords, especially in low-income housing areas, aren't incentivized to put solar panels on the roof because it doesn't really benefit them. It only benefits the people and the tenants who are living in these homes because it reduces their utility bills. And if you can help working people save money on their utility bills every month, it makes a pretty big difference in people's lives.
Here are our sources and then our group member roles. Thanks for listening.